Hello, Bio 130 students, and welcome to lesson number 2 of the circulatory system, the very first topic, and it's a topic that I very much enjoy. It is blood types. For humans, we have more or less 4 types of blood, and essentially what is happening is that there are antigens on the surface of our red blood cells that tell the body these belong there. And therefore, the body will form antibodies in the blood stream that essentially help recognize foreign objects or things that are not normally in the body and should not be in the body. And here's a way of interpreting blood types. Essentially, what determines what type of antigens you will have on the surface of your red blood cells. And, what determines those is essentially alleles, which an allele is one part of a gene that you will inherit from both parents. You will inherit one allele from your biological father, and you will inherit one allele from your biological mother. And these come together to determine what kind of trait you will have. These can range from eye color, hair color, skin color, and internal things like what type of antigen is on your red blood cells. And when it comes to human blood types, essentially alleles can be one of 3. It can either be an A allele, which codes for A antigens around the surface of red blood cells, B alleles, which encode for B antigens, or O alleles, which encode for neither A or B antigens. Now, when it comes to alleles, there's essentially whether or not they're known as dominant or recessive. And essentially, A and B alleles are dominant, whereas O alleles are recessive. And here's a way of saying that. If you inherit, say, a dominant allele, and a recessive allele, for example, say you inherit an A allele from one parent and an O allele from the other parent, then is your blood type type A or is it type O? Because A is a dominant allele, it will take over, and therefore you will have blood type A. If you inherit 2 O alleles, one from each parent, then that is the only way that you could ever have O blood type, because O is a recessive allele. It will only show its trait if it is the only thing that is present. If there is an A allele or a B allele, they are dominant, therefore they will show their traits. You would have A blood type or B blood type, even if you inherit a B allele and an O allele from one parent and the other parent. Dominant alleles, they will always show up let's get to the next slide. Here are the combinations of inherited alleles to end up having blood type A, to have blood type A. If you inherit an A allele from your biological father and from your biological mother, then you inherited 2 A alleles, your blood type will be type A. But say from one parent you inherit a allele and from one parent you inherited a recessive O allele. Since A is dominant, it will show its traits and O will be a silence partner. It will not show its trait. Therefore, if you inherit an A and an O, your blood type will still be type A. Likewise, the two possible combinations to have type B blood is if you inherited two B alleles, one from each parent, or if you inherited a B allele from one parent and a recessive O allele from the other parent. Since B is dominant and O is recessive, B will be the one that shows up as a physical trait. Therefore, those are the two combinations to have type B blood. Now, a rare type of blood is type AB. This is because A and B alleles are equally dominant. Therefore, if you inherit an A from one parent and a B allele from the other parent, they will both encode their traits. Therefore, going to the picture, to the vertical column labeled group AB, if you inherit an A allele and a B allele, essentially those red blood cells will have A antigens and B antigens around those red blood cells. Whereas someone with A blood type would only have A antigens around their blood cells, and someone with B blood type would only have B antigens around their red blood cells. And say the situation where both parents, where a person inherits only an O allele from each parent, well then O is a recessive allele. Therefore, if it is the only thing that is being shown, then it will show its trait. Therefore, type O blood is only possible if you receive an O allele from each parent. And what will happen is the red blood cells will not have antigens for A blood type, nor will they have antigens for B blood type. Now, what does this mean? Well, let's say someone needs a blood donation, or they get a scratch and somehow accidentally get someone else's blood into their system. If someone is blood type A, that means that they have A antigens around their red blood cells. That tells the body that A is something that should be in the body normally. Well, if someone was given foreign B blood, so blood type B blood in their body, the body would not recognize those B antigens as native to the body, and the human body would form anti-B antibodies, which will attack the B blood. If someone has blood type B, then they only have B antigens around their red blood cells. Therefore, if someone was given blood type A red blood cells, the A antigens around the blood would not be recognized as native and would be recognized as foreign to the body. Therefore, the body would form anti-A antibodies to attack the A blood. With someone with AB blood, their red blood cells will naturally have A and B antigens around their red blood cells. Therefore, they can accept A blood, they can accept B blood transfusions because they will not form antibodies to type A or type B blood because they already have those antigens on their red blood cells. And their bodies will recognize A and B blood as normal, as appropriate in their body. O blood, on the other hand, O blood does have antigens around their red blood cells. They just lack the antigens that are A antigens and B antigens. O blood will therefore, if given a transfusion of O blood, or if given a transfusion of A type blood or B type blood, they will not recognize those blood transfusions as safe for the body and will recognize them as foreign. Therefore, they would either form anti-A antibodies or anti-B antibodies, depending on what was transfused into them. It is for this reason that people with O blood type can only accept blood transfusions from people who are also O, who also have type O blood. Otherwise, they would form antibodies and reject the blood transfusions if it came from someone who's A, B, or AB. And being given a blood that does not mix with your blood is very dangerous because it can cause coagulation or, that foreign blood to coagulate, to essentially block your veins, and that can cause a whole slew of trouble. Strokes, dangerous prevention of the safe flow of blood, things like that. So people with A blood can accept transfusions that involve A blood because they will not form antibodies to those A antigens, but they can also accept blood from people with O blood because people with O blood do not have B antigens on their red blood cells. Therefore, this will not cause someone with A blood type to form B antigens. Likewise, someone with B blood can accept blood from someone who is also type B or someone who is type O, because someone who is type O does not have A antigens on the red blood cells. Therefore, those red blood cells will not be recognized as foreign. And someone with AB blood can accept blood from someone who is type A, type B, type A, or type B because they already have those A and B antigens on the red blood cells, or accept blood from someone who is type O because type O does not have A or B antigens on the body, on the red blood cell. Therefore, neither would be recognized as foreign. Now, there is one other way to differentiate blood, and that's the Rhesus factor, where something can be Rh positive or Rh negative. And there are many different types of Rh factors, but one that is specifically talked about is Rhd. That's what is being referred to when someone says they're like A positive, B positive, or say AB negative or O negative. And essentially, positive, inheriting a positive allele is a dominant allele, whereas a negative allele is essentially a recessive trait. Therefore, say someone inherits an A allele from both parents and inherits a positive allele from one parent and a negative allele from the other parent, well, both alleles are A, so the blood type will be type A, and one of those plus minus, one of the Rhesus factor alleles inherited was positive. Therefore, positive is dominant. This will cause that person to have A positive blood. And positive basically means you have the Rhd factor antigen. That antigen is present. Negative means that antigen is not present. And if an antigen is not normally present in your body will form antibodies to that antigen if it ever comes in contact with it. Another example is, say, someone inherits a B allele and a negative Rh allele from one parent, and inherits an O allele and a positive Rh factor allele from the other parent. Well, B is a dominant allele, O is recessive, so that will cause that person to have a type blood type of type B. But O is the dominant trait for the Rh factor. Positive is the dominant trait for the Rh factor. Therefore, that overall blood type will be B positive. And say, in my situation where both parents gave an O allele and both the parents gave a negative Rh factor allele, well then my blood type is O negative, O being recessive and only showing up as the overall trait because I only inherited O alleles, and it's O negative because I did not inherit any positive Rh factor genes. Well, Rhd factors. And basically this means that someone who is O negative, they do not have A or B antigens, and they do not have Rh positive antigens. They lack the A and B and the Rh factor antigens. Therefore, that blood being transferred to anyone else, say someone is A positive, well, they will not react to any B antigens because that's not present on O, red blood cells. And if someone is positive, the fact that someone who is O negative lacks Rh factor antigens means that there's nothing to react to. If someone who is O positive donates blood to someone who's O negative, well, the O would still match, but if you give Rh positive blood to someone who is normally Rh negative, the body will start seeing that there are Rh antigens present and will form antibodies to those antigens. The whole core of the story is if your body normally has certain antigens in it, it will not react to blood that also has those same antigens. If your body normally lacks some antigens, then it will form antibodies if it ever comes in contact with other blood that does have those antigens. And some diseases of the heart, congenital heart disease, this is a physical deformity and present at birth. And this physical deformity hampers the proper flow of blood. One example could be septa defects, which are holes in that septum that is meant to separate the right and left chambers of the heart, thus allowing the mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood from both ventricles, which is not good for a mammal as large as us. Now, it also could be obstruction defects, which essentially causes a hampering in the flow of blood through the various chambers, whether partially or fully, blocking the flow. Surgery is the usual way of fixing these, whether giving a graft to seal up the hole of that heart, of that septa, so that eventually the heart will seal over it itself, or cutting out the obstruction. And, well, these are generally life-saving. Now, arrhythmia is also another disorder of the heart. This essentially has to do with, in some way, shape, or form, some loss of regular beat rhythm. Arrhythmia is just any type of disorder where the heart is not beating its usual rhythm. Tachycardia is when the heart rhythm is too fast, and bradycardia is where the heart beats too slowly. Premature ventricle contractions are when, say, the ventricles pump blood before the atria fully puts blood into them. Under a normal situation, the left atrium should fully pump the blood in it, into the left ventricle, and the right atrium should fully pump its stored blood into the right ventricle. That way, afterwards, they can begin to fill up as the ventricles push the blood that they just took in. If the atria are still pumping blood into the ventricles, as those ventricles push that blood, then they're not officially taking as much blood into them as they should. Therefore, you might be pumping less oxygenated blood to the parts of the body, or you might be pumping less volumes of deoxygenated blood back to the heart or back to the lungs. And then another form of arrhythmia is fibrillation, which is basically the heartbeat is irregular. So instead of being some consistent beat, whether it being consistently too slow or consistently too fast, it might be beating to some rhythm and then skip a beat, or might change its rhythm and then go back to something else. It's basically just not being a consistent beat. And, well, medications or a pacemaker can help solve the irregularities. Anemia is another type of blood condition, and it involves a deficiency of red blood cells, or a deficiency in the protein hemoglobin, which is essentially what binds to oxygen and allows red blood cells to carry it to where it needs to be. And hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that binds to carbon dioxide, allowing red blood cells to carry carbon dioxide back to lungs. And one cause could be iron deficiency. A key metal in hemoglobin is iron. This is the actual point where oxygen binds or carbon dioxide binds. If your body does not have an appropriate amount of iron, if it's deficient in iron, well, then iron deficiency anemia can set in due to excessive, if, for example, you get cut in a really bad way and you're losing a lot of blood, that could cause iron deficiency anemia because you just don't have the appropriate levels of iron to bind to a healthy amount of oxygen or to help get rid of a healthy amount of carbon dioxide. When there is no dangerous opening in the blood vessels, normal iron deficiency anemia can be solved through iron supplements or quick transfusion of blood that has the appropriate amount of iron within their red blood cells. Anemia can also be based off of morphology, or the actual shape of the red blood cells themselves. And two examples of anemia that are caused by morphology is megaloblastic anemia and sickle cell anemia. Megaloblastic anemia is essentially the bone marrow produces abnormally large and immature red blood cells. They're not fully developed, and they're not the right size to travel in large numbers throughout the blood vessels. Megaloblastic anemia, essentially those cells are pretty large and they don't allow for an efficient flow of, you can't pass too many of them from one part of the body to the other. And sickle cell anemia is a genetic disorder causing malformed red blood cells. Essentially, the hemoglobin protein is altered. Therefore, it's not as efficient at carrying oxygen. Therefore, someone who has sickle cell anemia, those sickle cell red blood cells will not be able to carry as much oxygen as a healthy red blood cell would. Therefore, they're distributing less oxygen throughout their body and carrying less carbon dioxide back per unit of cell. Generally, when it comes to morphology types of anemia, they're hard to treat because they're a genetic cause. It won't necessarily cause all the afflicted person's cells to be abnormal, but the ones that are abnormal, it's really hard to treat. And just one last slide to actually show what these look like. For example, megaloblastic anemia, which actually could look like multiple red blood cells that actually are fused together. Or sickle cell anemia, which is the image on the right, which is essentially some cells will look like little sickle spikes. And these types of cells, they actually have a higher tendency of getting stuck amongst each other, which can cause a blood blockage, which could cause death in arteries and veins, which is not good. And that effectively concludes our final lesson into the circulatory system, also known as the cardiovascular system. So just slightly past the 26.5-minute mark, I am glad to conclude this lengthy lesson of the human body. Catch you all in the very next lesson.